Podcast by Friday, episode 30.
And on today's show, we are going to be discussing how to create content your audience can't wait to listen to. This episode is going to be really one of those kind of episodes where you are in for a lot of practical ideas that we'll share with you. Most of our episodes are that way anyway, but this one in particular, I really like this because it's one of those areas that most podcasters, most bloggers, anyone who creates content it's a bit challenging and find it a bit challenging. So we are going to discuss and tackle this head on today and hopefully give you enough information that you will be truly satisfied with. I know you will. Stay tuned.
Podcast by Friday with Bill Griggs and Kingsley-Grant. We help people to create their minimal viable podcast by taking bold action to defeat procrastination and to get their voices heard.
I am Kingsley-Grant.
And I'm Bill Griggs.
And we are the hosts of Podcast by Friday.
Good afternoon, Kingsley-Grant. How are you today?
Hey, I am doing fantastic, Bill. I don't know what time it is for the person who's listening right now, if it's afternoon, morning, or night, but whatever time it is for them, I want to say I am doing great this moment here, sitting in South Florida.
Yeah, it's always a wonderful day when we can do another episode of Podcast by Friday. I really look forward to this. It's the highlight of my week, and I hope it's the highlight of your week too, listeners.
Yeah, I think I would think it is, because you know what? I believe that we have the right kind of listeners who, if we're having a good time, I believe they're having a good time too, because we tend to attract likeness. And I have no doubt that that person who's listening right now would say, yeah, I am having a fantastic day too. If not, by the end of this episode, he or she will say that they're having a fantastic day.
Yeah, this episode is one that probably needs to be discussed, and maybe should have been discussed a little earlier in the series of podcasts that we've been doing, but it is very relevant to every content creator, and it's about creating content your audience can't wait to listen to.
And I can't wait to talk about it, Bray. I mean, I'm excited about this because, we've heard the phrase many times, content is king, And I think that there's a reason why people have made that reference to content being that way, right? I mean, I'm not sure in what context have you heard that?
Yeah, I've heard that said, and nothing is really more of a truth than that fact. But sometimes we take it for granted that everybody knows what we're talking about when we talk about content or we use that word. And, I think we should break it down for our listeners, and tell them, what is content?
You're so right, Bill, because I know at times I assume that everyone knows what I'm talking about when I use certain terms. And I believe that when there's one of those terms like this one, content, needs to be kind of expanded on so that we are on the same page as far as our working definition of the word content. And what we're using is a valuable, relevant, concise information for an audience.
Yeah, and we thought about it that for a little while before we came down to that definition of it, because when you think about content, content has to be good and it has to be worth your time, and so it needs to be valuable to you. It needs to be relevant to whatever it is that you're trying to work on. And most of all, it should be concise or very, gets to the point quickly so that you can learn whatever it is that you're trying to absorb from that content.
Especially in a time where people want to have information so quickly and they are not necessarily are going to wait around for it. So I think you're right. The more concise it can be, of course, very relevant, then the chance is they're going to want to consume that. And that's what we're about when we do content, especially in the contents of podcasting. So, Bill, we talked about what is content. What are the different forms of content that have that this term have been used in?
Yeah, it's it's true that people absorb information many different ways. Some people like to absorb their information visually, some through auditory, some through spoken storytelling, etc. But content can come in a lot of forms. In the first form that we use predominantly in podcasting is audio form. This podcast episode is an example of an audio content because you listen to it.
Go ahead.
And, versus a video that you might see on YouTube, okay, which would be another form of content that you could use. And, that gets your eyes, the sense of sight involved. There is written content or text, and that could be a blog post or a transcript from your audio file. And there are also images, which are just pictures. So those are the four basic forms of content. So,
Bill, is there any advantage? Because I know sometimes people are wondering which is best. And you mentioned about the different styles that people would consume content in. But is there one that most times, well, I wouldn't say most times, but is there one that is better than the other?
I don't think so. I think that if you're trying to create content that people just can't wait to listen to or to watch or to see, you need to create content that's appropriate for where you're going to be placing it. So if they're getting your content on iTunes, they probably want to listen to it in audio format. But somebody who's on YouTube might want to listen to or see video content, and or folks who are into surfing websites might want to see something written or pictures. So there is no magic bullet for the content, and if you can create it in multiple formats, so much the better.
I like what you just said just now. I think it's just the multiplicity of content of formats or forms we might use, which makes a difference, I believe. So that's a good point you're making, Bill. And of course, a podcast, we are typically focused on an audio content and, of course, text at times. We'll talk more about that later on. So I think the next question I find, especially in the podcast world, is where people have a difficult time, Bill, is locating content. Where do they find content? Because, it's not like content is just sitting around and say, here I am podcast content, right? We've got to become creative to then find the kind of content we want to help our audience, consume. So, number one, I believe that we need to know who our audience is, number one, to decide what kind of content we want to bring them. But where do we go to find this kind of content we're describing?
Well, you have to be purposeful in getting content and creating content. Because information is all around us. I mean, we're receiving so much information from so many different sources, and it just takes you to distill the idea of what you wanted to, what information you want to convey to your audience, and create content around that. So, one place to find out what the audience would love to hear about is, in fact, the audience through audience feedback. Which may be a little difficult for some of our listeners because many of you are just getting started with your podcast and may not have an audience yet. And so it's really tough to get feedback early on. But once you do have an audience, that is probably the best place through, correspondence and interactions you have with your audience about what their questions are, what their pains are, what their problems are.
And that's another good point you're making. And I think sometimes that kind of feedback is really when that time does come that you've created an audience, that you find it from them. What are some things that they're interested in? Because we can create content thinking our audience wants it and are interested in it. We find that they're not. So I think at some point we want to make sure that is. So I really like that the first place you went, because I believe that above and beyond anything else, that's one of the primary place to get content from. But I also think that in addition to that, personal experiences. When I should write or I do my podcast episodes, I want to inject some of my own personal life, because I believe that a person can relate when they hear a story that is similar to theirs. And that is content. And people are really, they want to know. They want to know that, hey, you know what? Have you ever experienced what I'm experiencing? So personal experiences in our stories are so key, so vital. I don't suggest you make the whole show about yourself, because it's not about you, right, or me. But we inject those in as needed to make a point and to help the person realize that we too have similar experiences.
Yeah, one of the best parts about sharing your personal experiences with your audience is that it makes you relatable to them and them to you. There's nothing better than a good story, and a story that really happened about something that you've been through that they may be going through is fantastic subject for the creation of your content. So that's a very good one, Kingsley. I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that I like to do when I'm not using one of these two formats is I will sometimes get ideas from other podcasts and books and like webinars and things that I've watched. I mean, there are some fantastic creative minds out there, and to find out, a subject that they're writing about, if they're writing about it and it's good, you can write about it too.
Yeah, you're right. I find that I'm inspired sometimes. I was just listening to someone recently who, he writes this content every single day, and the question was asked, where do you get that much content to put out every single day? And he said, well, of course, it's a muscle being built up, but sometimes he gets stuck. And what he does is he will go and scan real quickly some news feed or any kind of feed that he can find. And many times that inspiration comes and he just write an article based upon that. And I believe the same is true here for podcasts, because sometimes I will do this very same thing. I get an idea by where I'm, reading a book or listening to a podcast or have gone to a workshop or a webinar. Those things are very, very important. But I also like, videos where I go to YouTube, and sometimes I'm just, as anybody would, not cruising. What's the word I'm looking for here? Surfing. I'm surfing YouTube, and I come across some very valuable piece of information that I can learn something from. What a wonderful way to take that and teach someone else what I've just learned in watching a video.
Oh, yeah. I get a lot of inspiration from videos that I watch on YouTube or on Facebook. Facebook is now, ramping up very strongly with their video content. There's a lot of video content on Facebook as well. So between YouTube and Facebook, you can come up with all sorts of content. And in some cases, with the proper permissions, you can use those videos or at least links to those videos in your show. And I want to back up a second there, Kingsley, if you don't mind.
Please do.
You were talking about ideas from other podcasts, books, and webinars just a second ago, and listening to other people's podcasts to get some idea to how to do things. Well, recently in my other podcast, the CNC Router Tips podcast, I got a chance to interview New York Times bestselling author Chris Guillebeau about his new book that was just coming out. And after we were done with the interview and everything was, published and everything got out there, Chris was making the rounds on some of the podcast circuits, and he was interviewed by other people like John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneur on Fire and, other people. And I think he was also interviewed by Andrew Warner from Mixergy. So anyway, by listening to those episodes, I got actually things that never came out in my interview and vice versa. And it just gave me a whole different spin on some of the things that he was talking about. So, it's very cool to hear what others are saying about the same person sometimes, or the same subject, and, creating their own little spin on it.
I like that, because I believe that we can always learn from someone else, and we can hear something a certain way that was shared that we never thought about, and we can now also take that and put our own spin on that and create our own podcast, episode with that. So I really like that. I'm glad you went back to that, because that's a great interview. And I want to say, I want to kind of put a plug in here. Bill may not do that, but I would recommend you go, and we have the link in the show notes, and you can go and listen to that interview that Bill did with Chris Gilliboo, because I believe he did a great job, and just to hear him about his new book. And I want to, recommend that, because I too am interested in getting that his new book, and I think you asked some very good questions. So we'll have a link in the show notes, but I know you didn't say that, but I'm going to put that out there, and I want you to, as you're listening, to make sure you go and listen to that. But you're right, because even when I listen to you in the interview, Bill, I get some ideas. I said, okay, when I do something about the business online for someone in my other podcast, Smooth Career Change, I could talk about what you and him discuss. So I know I get some ideas from that myself.
Mm-hmm. Yep. For those who want to take a listen to it, or, shameless plug here.
Go ahead.
You can go to cncroutertips.com. That's cncroutertips.com/52. That's episode 52. And that should take you to the episode where we talk with Chris Gilliboo about creating a CNC side hustle. So thank you very much for that plug.
Sure, of course, and we'll make sure we have it in the show notes. Another area I find, Bill, is social media. Wow, social media, man, we are almost always on social media, and I can get ideas from that myself. And I'm sure as you're listening in, and you probably are on social media, just kind of, again, surfing and mindless surfing sometimes. Think about this. What is it that strikes you? What is it that catches your attention? And the chance is that very same thing, if you can create some content around that, will be important and catch the attention of your audience as well.
Yeah. I spend a lot of time, an inordinate amount of time, on Facebook, inside of a Facebook group that I created. And one of the things that I did inside that group was I created a Tuesday's Tips section where the members give each other tips on, shortcuts or special techniques or whatever things that they did. And because, through the power of social media, I mean, we were able to get 10,000 people into that group, which is awesome. But it gives me a whole bunch of content. And I'm about to do an episode where I take those Tuesday tips and I, turn them into a podcast, just giving credit where credit's due. That's the kind of thing that can occur through social media. And it doesn't have to be as formal as that, but you can get to know a whole new group of people just through social media, like Facebook or Twitter or, Instagram or Snapchat.
That's so cool. You know what? I think because, again, the people who are getting the feedback to you on social media are sometimes your audience, people who are in your audience. So I think it's a very good idea to take that and make content out of it,
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, there's another place where you can get content from as well. Kingsley is along those lines, and that's through Newsfeeds. There are also, CNN has a news feed. Forbes magazine has a news feed. Pretty much every topic of interest, there's a news feed about that, including the major broadcast networks. Have you ever gotten content that you?
Oh yes. I mean, sometimes I just kind of and sometimes I don't even open up the actual, maybe the article that's been featured on the newsfeed area. I just basically sometimes just by reading the very topic itself, it captures my attention and immediately spark in my mind, how would I write or record a podcast around that topic matter? And
I'm so glad you went there.
And then I will immediately begin to do that.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, if you're trying to learn how to write copy is the stuff that you read to convince your audience of something or other, and headlines, check out the news feed, because they've only got a few seconds in order to hook you onto whatever the topic is they're writing. And the way they write their headlines might be beneficial to you when you're writing subjects for your episodes and for your content.
So we've also, before we go and recap this list of, this is a lot we've kind of mentioned so far, but I find as well, Bill, when I go to take a course online or go to a workshop, I can also find very helpful material from there. So, I mean, really, this is a slew of places. I mean, this is no exhaustive list of where you can find content to create for your audience.
Sure. I mean, we can even throw in your guests that you have on your show as another source of content. I mean, we could go on and on all day, but that's the point. Content is all around you. You just have to be aware of it and look for it.
I love that summary. Content is all around you. You just got to look for it and just keep your eyes open, and you'll find that. So we mentioned audience feedback, personal experiences, ideas from podcasts, books, webinars, videos, YouTube, news feeds, social media, courses, guests. Really, these are just some of the places that we have mentioned and found for ourselves to be helpful when we're looking for content. So we know that this also will be a good place to start, that you can get your podcast up and running very quickly and not worry about, where do I find content? Now you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But this kind of begs the question, Kingsley. How long should our content be?
That's a very good question. Now, what I've the rule of thumb that I have heard and operated by for all these years really is, as long as it takes to get your message across and no longer.
Amen. Yeah, I mean, it can range from anywhere from 3 minutes to 3 hours.
Yes.
But, cover your topic completely and stop.
I like that. I had a friend. I know I've never done that. I don't think I could, but he listened to a podcast that was I think 6 hours of podcast, 2 or 3 hour podcast he did. And I'm saying, are you out of your mind? But it was such an intriguing podcast, and he found so much value out of it. He did that, so I guess, it all depends, right? And I like what you just said, make it no longer, and whatever it takes to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, if you get it all, if you put all the content into one episode, what are you going to put in the next one? So
I know. I guess some people are just so filled with information that they can just give. I mean, you go to an event like a Tony Robbins event, and here this guy can speak for hours and hours and hours. Brendan Burchard, I went to one of his event, and this guy did a 2.5 day, 3 day event every day for almost like 10 hours straight. And of course, you have a break for lunch and so on. But he was on for the main, of course, the third day or so. He had other people come in, but nonstop. So, I guess it's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So having all this in mind, now we're getting, we've got an idea for where to find content, how long it should be, and everything. But now let's apply the content to our shows. How will we use the content? What format would we use to do our content to give it the best shot at having people want to listen to it?
This is one of the questions that I believe some people have a hard time with, because there are different formats that people use for their podcasts. And we're going to give a general overview of what we do, but also what I find a lot of podcasters and those people who have gone to speakers courses, workshops and so on have heard. And that is that we begin our show with some kind of introduction, an opening of some kind, which could take different formats, right? For us, we mentioned our episode number. On your show by yourself, CNC Router, you do the very same thing. I do the same thing on Smooth Career Change, where I mention the episode number right away, and I introduce right up front what that podcast is going to be. Is that how you find, Bill, that some podcasts you listen to or that tend to have that as a format, or do you find to be different?
Yeah, there are many podcasts that use that format. I know that, for instance, Internet Business Mastery will, announce the episode number and say today's show is going to be about content creation and how you can use it to rule the world or whatever.
Right.
And then there are others who take a slightly different approach. Like, for instance, when we start up an episode of Podcast by Friday, we don't always get right to what the topic is. We usually interact with each other a little bit before. I think that's partly because we miss each other and we haven't talked all week.
Yes.
But, because we live in different sides of the country. But, there are advantages and disadvantages to each method. And, can discuss those.
And so I like the idea, though, of when I go to listen to a podcast, that someone tells me, where they're going to take me, what direction they're going to have me follow them, so I guess it's also preference, I think, but I think for our show, we've done that. And so the episode number, the introduction of the show, and what the show's all going to be about is the opening of the show. And sometimes, and I know, I have that as well, is have a voiceover that I have had someone, paid someone to do for me. And I've also had other people who have been guests on my show and so on to give a voiceover of some kind to introduce my show.
Or a testimonial.
Or a testimonial, yeah. And I put them right up front.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes sense, get the audience attention right away because, they're making a choice when they start listening to a podcast, whether they're going to continue to listen to the podcast after just a few seconds. That's one of the reasons why you want to get your episode number and what the show's about out quickly so that they can decide whether they want to do it.
And I think also that what I like about what, you've done and I've done is sometimes in the very beginning is take a teaser. So a snippet of a show, of the interview or a show, and just take a small clip of that and put it up front so a person can know kind of a taste of what is to come. It's like going to, the mall and you walk around in these restaurants will have these tasters, right? And they're saying, taste some of this and you're like, okay. And once you taste it, you're going to like, okay, let me have a meal of that,
Yeah, I try and avoid the bourbon chicken in the mall because I know I'm going to end up eating it.
Oh, that happens to you too, right? I do the very same thing. I always end up having a bourbon chicken. And those are the people who are actually out there. Come, have some. Yeah, here, yeah, have some, yeah, here.
Yeah, and that's their intro. Once they got that little snippet of a meal into you, you're hooked.
That's the intro, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then, you get the body or the meat of the show after that.
Yeah, you're going to get the whole tray of it. Like, I want the whole tray, not just a little piece.
Yeah. Give it to me. And that's the way you should approach your content when you're giving it out to your audience. Get that hook in there real quick and then give them the meal. I think they're going to pay for the meal, but that's the point. They're the main body of your information should come right after that hook while they're still tasting that bourbon chicken in their mouth.
I like that. While the taste is still there, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why we mentioned earlier about the working definition we're using of this is, of what content is, a valuable, relevant, concise information. Now we want to make certain that they're not going to get that meat, that body of what they're being baited to come and have more of. And now they're in that regards. And they're listening in. You're giving them the meat, the body, the valuable, relevant.
Yep. Yeah, and you got to deliver.
Yeah, because now you've gotten them. You better give them the food right now and then, or it's over. So I agree,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you know, and as different parts of the information come up, you can use different methods to go from one topic to the next. You know, to transition within the body of the show. That that's just as part of the craft of learning how to do things. I mean, you look back at soap operas, and you could name any soap opera, and they've all been on for 20 or 30 years with variations of the same characters. Why do you keep tuning in after the episode? Is because at the end of each episode, there's a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some reason that you got to find out what happened tomorrow, and you keep coming back. And you should use that in your podcast.
Because I think it's how we as human beings, we are curious, right? We want to know what's happening, and we don't want to be left out. We don't want to, the whole idea of FOMO, fear of missing out. So I want to make certain that I get what you have. So those cliffhangers is a great way to do that. And I believe that also I find that, which I like what you do sometimes, which we well, is when you have a question you may ask a guest, and or something, a point you're about to make, and you introduce a point, but then you kind of at that moment quickly go into a sponsorship mode, because again, people are like, okay, I'm not going to leave. Come on, hurry up so I can get to the rest of the story,
Mm-hmm. Yep, because the person listening should be like at the edge of their seat, yes, wanting to know what that answer is. And then when you play your sponsorship message or your whatever your offer is for that show, they're already listening closely, so they're going to listen closely to the sponsor, and then you get right back into it and tell them, you get them down off the cliff after that. But
we have talked about then, Bill. Now they have had the meal. They've come in. We've teased them out. They had a taste. They've come in. They've had the meal, the body of the show, which I think is so important, and that could take up the majority of the time, because you want to make certain that the person leave full. They leave like, boy, all I want to go now is have my bed, or or do something with what it is they've just heard. So the person have finished their meal. They've now had the meat, the valuable, relevant content is concise. They've got it. What do we want them to do with that information, Bill? Because I find sometimes that's where the tricky part comes in, that a person is not asked to do something else. Again, going back to the restaurant idea, you're going to be asked, in some regards, tell somebody about what you just experienced. You want to share that with other people who are going to come back and say, hey, man, you want some free chicken or bourbon chicken? Go to this restaurant here in the mall. They're going to go there, and they too are going to get hooked. So they're called upon, in a sense, to do something with what they've just experienced. How do we do that in podcasts?
Well, the big thing to know is once you have this content that you've painstakingly built and delivered to your audience, it has to be actionable. It has to be something that they can take and apply right away. And so you need to give them what they call in the business a call to action. And a call to action is really just what you want your listeners to do with what you've shared with them next. It's very simple. Whether that's getting them to go and download a free guide to show them the steps of doing this, or a checklist, or whether it's to sign up for your course or whatever, you've got to tell them what you want them to do, and that's called a call to action.
And sometimes, I find, Bill, where people are thinking, oh, I don't want to ask them. I'm timid. I don't want to ask and put more burden on people. But I find that that's really an error in our thought process. And we need to make certain that we give people, a reason to have listened to us and taken the time. I believe it's a disservice if we don't direct them and instruct them what they should now do.
Yeah. If you haven't enabled your audience to achieve what it is that you talked about, to believe that they can do it, and to conceive their success from it, you're you're doing them a disservice. They have to be able to achieve, believe, and conceive what it is that you just taught them. There's probably a better way to say that too.
No, but I like that, Bill. I think it's really because the whole purpose of even entering the whole podcast realm and sharing content. I think what you just said just now is really behind the madness, so to speak, is that you're thinking. I'm hearing you're saying that you're believing that your audience are going to be able to achieve, believe, and what they've conceived, they and believe they can achieve.
Yes. Yep. Yep. I think when we were discussing this earlier, Kingsley, you came up with an even more concise. Because remember, that's one of the things we want to do. It's got to be valuable information. It's got to be relevant, and it's got to be concise. And you made it even more concise. The listener has to be able to
think they can do something, believe they can do something, and then do it. I believe that's what we're about. We're telling them, hey, you know what? We believe that you can do it. So we want you to think, believe, and do. And so I find that when a customer, our audience member, I hear my thing about customer because of the bourbon chicken.
I still got that. I may have to go to the mall.
I know, right? Maybe our listener right now is like say, "Oh, guys, your cats are making me hungry." Well,
somewhere out there's some guy in his car who just did a U-turn so he can head to the mall to get this bourbon chicken. So
well, hey, make sure you send us some. Okay, we'll give you our address and send us some afterwards and see.
Yeah, that's the call to action.
We believe they can do something, and now they too will be able to. I guess if they're going to be a podcaster, they can now know how to do one. But I believe it's more for you as you're listening in. We want you to no longer put off getting your podcast up because you're thinking, okay, you've told us about the actual physical parts of how to do a podcast, but I'm stuck because I don't know how to do the content. But my friend, now you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we shared with you things about, where to find the content, how to choose it, making sure that it's valuable, relevant, and concise. And we went down and we talked to you about how long it should be and, what formats we use that are successful. We told you the secret sauce of how we do the opening, then the body, and then the call to action. Now it's up to you to go out there and do something with it. And we would be remiss if we didn't call you to action right now. So our call to action for this episode is for you to go to our website, podcastbyfriday.com, and download our secret sauce, a checklist for this episode that tells you all of the things that you need to do to create content that your audience just can't wait to listen to. And so to do that, you would go to
podcastbyfriday.com/secret sauce.
That's right. Get your secret sauce right here. I'm going to get some bourbon chicken while I'm at it.
Me too. But you need to go to podcastbyfriday.com/secret sauce and get your checklist about this episode we have created for you today.